because when I started talking about my journey on the show openly, and I started to get, and I was blown away by this. I told the guys this, that my entire career as a personal trainer in gyms, this is 15 years ago, when I was working in gyms, I never met men under the age of 40 or 50 that would complain about low testosterone. When I started talking about it on the show, I was getting tons of DMs, and from young men, from men in their 20s who went and got their blood work done and were telling me their total testosterone was 170, 205, like Ouch. 25 years old, 23. I was blown away by how many young men were that. And then Sal talks about the studies that have been coming out about how much that's been declining. And I find that really fascinating that you're seeing, I expect that in a 50-year-old man, right? But not to see that in young men in their 20s. And I've been telling them, listen, I'm not a doctor. I don't know what to tell you in this situation, but I do know that we'll be talking to one on the show about this. And so I know there's a lot of people who have been waiting for this conversation, because I know it's helped me out tremendously. And I had no idea how many young men were struggling with this.
What's interesting about that is, the age level has dropped for those that are definite candidates for TRT. Now, you don't necessarily want to go out and check your testosterone levels. That's kind of a no-no. I mean, an engineer would do that, but a doctor is counseled against that because you don't want to open up a can of worms that doesn't need to be opened, because you don't treat numbers. But most of the time, people don't wake up and say, well, gee, I better check my testosterone today. They check their testosterone because they have some complaints. Right. So, it does kind of tie together that some of these 20-year-olds do have low testosterone, and there's a reason why they have symptoms of it, and there's a reason why they checked, et cetera. What's also interesting about that is, in my experience, it appears that stress is the big driver, and it makes sense medically. Arguably, 300 years ago, when life expectancy on average was like 30 years old, life was still different. And that average was driven down by, infant mortality, early death, that sort of thing. But, we're herding sheep for a living. Stress levels are pretty low. You're worried about an occasional wolf. And, that's, if it does happen, it's, maybe once a month or something like that. And that's what we're designed for, acute stress, not chronic stress. You wake up in today's world, and I'm not whining, but even my dad will say, your dad told you, I'm sure, same as mine. He went to and from school,
uphill both ways
in the snow, ate dirt and lived in the shoebox, for the first 20 years of his life. He'll say, yeah, you guys have it tougher than we do. And none of us here is whining, right? But it is a fact of life. And I see it in 20-year-olds. I mean, just look at Hollywood. Kind of maybe a funny side note. I got guys that are 20 years old with ED. Yeah. It's not because of low testosterone oftentimes. It's because they believe what's on that stupid box that says that you're supposed to be able to, and pardon me if this sounds crass, but you're supposed to be able to take care of, like Casanova, 5 women at one time and do so for 5 hours. And they're like, oh my God, really? That would freak anybody out. Mm-hmm. And so there's some mental stuff going on there that adds stress that can affect your ability to get an erection. Yeah. It drives testosterone levels down. And so in my early part of the career, I would say, well, this is stress driven. You're 28 years old. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I do see this, low testosterone in a 28-year-old. But why don't we think about some ways to lower stress? Well, some people put even more stress on the situation, because what do you do if you've already got 2.3 kids and a mortgage? You're going to go to Bali and become a beach bum, to lower your stress levels? That's not an option.
The real problem.
Now, the cool thing is, that being said, in a 26, 28-year-old, you have some other options besides TRT. So you can bring that 2.3 kids to a full 3 by preserving your fertility. In other words, you can raise your endogenous production, because your testicles are usually still working just fine. It's just your brain, because it's stressed out, is affecting your pituitary, which is right below the brain, sending a signal to testicles to do their job. So we can give them something called HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, no more abbreviations, and other things like off-label use of Clomid, or better yet, enclomiphene, which indirectly gets your pituitary to send a signal to testicles to make more testosterone. So we have, sort of a bridge gap there.
So is that what's more common practice then for you? If you got a 25 or 28-year-old young man that came in, complained of that, before you would say, hey, let's do 200 milligrams of testosterone. Let's first see if we can get this up with HCG or Clomid first.
Well, that's what I used to do back then, and I still do. I mean, I give them the option, because it really gets down to practicalities. Medicine tends to want to let the body do what it wants to do. And again, the biggest argument I have there is, well, that's great, but eventually we die. So, the whole anti-aging movement is, and get sick in the meantime too, is to try and improve the quality of life and get the best of what Mother Nature gives us and get rid of the worst. So my argument is, look, by the time you're 50, certainly, more than likely, odds are you're going to be on TRT, right? If at 30, you're having issues already, I want you to have the options. Even for some, it's just a mental aspect of, even though we are dependent upon air, food, and sleep, and for some of us other things, to live an enjoyable life, for some reason, having to do testosterone once a week is something you go, wait a minute, I don't want to be dependent on anything. Mm-hmm. And I get that psychologically. But to have a choice is nice, but I'm not going to necessarily counsel a 26-year-old, hey, you have to do it this way. If they've got abnormally low T, I certainly will suggest to them, just because it makes life easier, not just mentally, but if they want to father children, it's easier to maintain fertility than to try and regain it if you lose it, Right. Even though I would argue even that really these days is not a consideration. I mean, it is, but I can say this for sure. I've never had anybody lose fertility that didn't regain fertility for physiological reasons. I've had people for psychological reasons back in the day when we pull you off T and say, well, let's just hope it comes back, that, after 9 months, that forget about it. But these days, even while on TRT, if someone, which doesn't happen that often, loses their fertility, they can regain it by just jumping on some HCG, for example, human chorionic gonadotropin, to get the testicles to jump back online and get the sperm flowing again.
Yeah, that's great advice, because I feel like, a 25-year-old, I think the fear that I would have if I was in your shoes of just right away prescribing him testosterone is, that may mask all the other issues that he's got going on. Maybe he does have stress. Maybe he does have a lot of other bad habits that are causing some of that too. And just by simply elevating those for him may make him think that he's better, but he's really not addressing all the root causes.
Well, you bring up another issue that I wouldn't necessarily touch on, but since you bring it up, yeah, with those patients, invariably what I'll do is recommend something called an MRI of the head. We want to see if the pituitary is damaged, has a tumor on it, is missing an empty cell, we call it, because that can be an issue. We can also do some other tests because there might be an extra X chromosome, Klinefelter's disease. So we want to find all the possibilities because, again, at 28, it's unusual. Although, again, for stress reasons, we're seeing it way more often than we used to, even just 20 years ago. But in a 58-year-old, you go, well, okay, duh.
Yeah.
And so, you follow what's called a differential diagnosis where, if you see a hoof print, you look for a horse before you look for a zebra. You follow the things that make the most sense. But in a younger patient, you want to rule out some genetics. You want to rule out some enzyme issues where they might not be converting. I want to call it CAH. And then these issues with the pituitary. So that's part and parcel of evaluating someone who's a younger candidate for sure. Okay. Now that said, what happens if you do have it's called a pituitary microadenoma? It sounds scary. It's just a fancy way of saying you have a little small tumor on the pituitary, which by the way is rarely malignant. It's just a growth that's messing with your production of luteinizing hormone, right? What if someone says, well, okay, that's great, but I don't want you drilling, a hole usually through the roof of the mouth and taking that thing off. I don't want surgery. Then you're still back to square one, but at least you have a reason. And I think that's to your point. Mm. But also to your point, are there things that are typically deadly that come with low T, meaning that are driving it that you might miss? No.
Okay. Interesting.
So it's again pretty safe what we deal with.
Well, Dr. Rand, this is the first time we've wanted to, or actually worked with any hormone replacement therapy facility. There's been lots of people who wanted to work with us, talk with us. We did our homework. We chose working with you because the information you already have out on YouTube, the way you talk about the way you do, we really appreciate it. So it's great. And we do get tons of questions and DMs on this. It's like a big thing, especially when Adam talks about it.
I'm tired of trying to answer them. So
yeah, so
you brought a lot of clarity for me.
Yeah, so
too.
we appreciate you coming on the show, and we appreciate this, moving forward, because we'd love to have you back on answering specific questions at some point. and just talking to our audience, because this is definitely a big issue, a quality of life issue.
Well, I have a lot of fun doing it because, as with anything, it's like, I don't know, when you buy a new car, then all of a sudden you notice how many people have that same car on the road, right? Yeah. Not exactly a good analogy, but, I just figured everyone knew this stuff, more or less, and then we got to talking about it, like you said, on some of those YouTube videos, and you find out how many people go, wow, I didn't know that. I didn't realize that. So it really has been a lot of fun. And doctors live, I don't care what anybody says, doctors live for this, right? We want the pat on the back. Hey, thanks, doc. I really feel a lot better. And so it's been a great source of pleasure for me and everybody who works over on my team. I mean, like I say, it's a great job I have because you see a lot of happy patients, maybe not on the first day, but 90 days in, they come back and they go, doc, I feel so much better because of this, that, and the other. And we actually do get Christmas cards, every year. Hey,
That's
thanks.
awesome.
I had another great year. So.
Well, you did give a great analogy earlier about it being, the stigma around it being very similar like the marijuana industry. I just think there's still a lot of people around it that just think that it's, testosterone is this scary hormone that, you're doing drugs if you do it, and only these bodybuilders, and of course they attach it to the bodybuilders that died and think that it's because of that, or that you're going to beat your wife because you take testosterone. I mean, there's these awful stigmas that have been around for a long time around it that are still there. So no, I think there's a lot more education that needs to happen around it. So I'm excited to have you come on the show.
Yeah.
Well, to that end, just to add another tidbit before we sign off. I mean, the wife beater thing, the roid rage thing, is really, like I said earlier, I think it has to do with excess estrogen, making you moody and irascible rather than anything else. Excess DHT can make you edgy, but not that kind of roid rage type stuff. And that goes back to, the problems with so many things comes with mismanagement, not doing it the right way. Right. And as long as you keep the estrogen down, it's not going to turn Dr. Jekyll into Mr. Hyde. But what I tell people is, if you're already
an asshole,
and I won't name names. Well, let's just use that.
If you're already an asshole, you're just a bigger asshole.
Exactly. Perfect. I couldn't have said it better. It's not going to turn you into one. So that's the only caveat I would say. For some people, maybe it's good that you let a little air out of their tire, but they were that way their whole life.
In other words, don't call Dr. Rand if you're an asshole.
Please refrain.
Yeah. No, thanks again. Thanks for coming on the show.
No, my pleasure.